Welcome to Connect with Success with Dr. Lynette Scotese-Wojtila, where we help connect you with knowledge. Our mission is to lead you to a new and exciting way of understanding, responding to, and helping all those with autism. We hope to expand your thinking about how to best serve these amazing people and to support you in your daily struggles and celebrations.
Welcome, everyone, to the 8th episode of Connect with Success, a podcast built around the Success Approach and the person who coined it, Dr. Lynette Scotese-Wojtila. In episode 7, we introduced the next foundational application of the Success Approach, which was built around socialization and autism. And in this episode, we're going to build on this discussion by adding developmental basics to our talk as part of the Success Approach. Let's take a moment before we jump in, though, to talk with Dr. Lynette about today's term for the show.
Today's term is developmental sequence. Developmental sequence is basically a concept that all professionals who serve children are trained to know and should be operating under. And what it means, though, is that skill acquisition happens in sort of a step-by-step fashion. So we might consider it sort of like a linear process. And a quick example would be we absolutely would expect a child to be able to sit before they could run. And that seems obvious to us as we think about the sequence of skill development. But it becomes a challenge, and we're going to talk today about how that challenge manifests for kids with autism when we're not really solid on the developmental sequence, and we might accidentally expect a child to be able to perform a particular skill before they're really ready developmentally.
Wow. So we've got some steps to take then for this episode. And we're going to introduce in just a moment here back to the show is Ellen Whitney. So hold on one moment. We'll get right to the message. Welcome back to the message. And I'm very fortunate again to have in studio with me not just Dr. Lynette Scotese-Wojtila, but Ellen Whitney, who I consider a master teacher in developmental model. And so we're so excited to have you back, Ellen.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's good to be here.
So tell us a little more about the developmental model and the sequencing of events.
Well, as Dr. Lynette said, a developmental model is something that all professionals should be trained in, and really anybody who took a human development class in college, it should be a concept that is familiar. And that's the idea that the brain development dictates our skill development, and things should happen in a step-by-step process. And so if we look at many different areas, whether it be, as Lynette said, physical motor development or fine motor development, social development, cognition, all of those skills within there happen in a very linear fashion in neurotypical development. And so it's a concept, though, that we might lose sight of a little bit, even with neurotypical children, but also becomes more complicated when we add in autism and some of the challenges that are experienced there.
So this is another situation where in the last 2 episodes we've talked about this is a normal process for everyone. We all go through this. It just might look different for someone who's on the spectrum.
Absolutely. And our goal when we're treating from the Success Approach is to honor that developmental sequence because it's a neurodevelopmental model. It's right in the wording of it. We are going to honor the natural, normal development that the human brain goes through. Even when there is a diagnosis, we're still going to honor that because that's how we're designed to work.
And so how would you say it affects those who are trying to develop in general, just in general? Like walk us through what an example might be.
So, for example, if we are to look at handwriting skill development, as an OT, that's kind of in my bag there to be very familiar with it. And so there's a very typical developmental sequence that a child needs to go through before they're ready to actually write their letters. And so they need to first be able to imitate a vertical line, and then a horizontal line, and then a circle, then a diagonal line, square, triangle, X. And then they need to be able to copy that where you show them a picture of it, and they're going to be able to do that. All of that should be acquired before we would ever have the expectation that they would be able to write their letters. And then even within that, capital letters would become before lowercase letters. Unfortunately, we've lost sight of that a lot of times, and handwriting is a skill that's not always taught anymore. And so a child gets plopped into a kindergarten classroom, and it's journal time first thing in the morning, and they've never been appropriately taught their letter formation, and we get all kinds of interesting variations and or kids that are getting referred for services because their handwriting is atrocious when they've never actually been checked to see do they even have the developmental skills. And I'll tell you, a lot of times those children don't have those skills until 5 or 6, and that's just the way we were designed. And yet even now in preschool, in the name of kindergarten readiness, we're expecting 3 and 4-year-olds to be able to write their first and last name in proper case. And so that's where we can kind of see some of these issues come up, that if we don't honor developmental sequence, we not only frustrate the child and set them up for failure, but we put unfair expectations on them, we frustrate ourselves, and we really kind of get in our own way of really helping the child to succeed.
Wow. And for those who struggle with it in the developmental sequence, who are on the spectrum, how else would that manifest itself? So
interestingly, for our kids that are on the spectrum, they oftentimes develop what we call splinter skills, where it almost seems like they skip part of the developmental process and they get like this really higher level skill that emerges, but they don't have the foundational skills below it to support it. And so there's not a lot of real meaning and function around it. So, for example, our kids, as you guys talked about in information processing, because of their episodic learning style, they're fantastic at memorizing rote facts. So a child could, be 4 years old and know all their timetables and to be able to say, 2 times 2 is 2, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8. And we'd be like, wow, they're a math genius. They know all their math facts, but they don't understand the concept that 2 times 4 means you have 2 sets of 4 items each, and able to, what does that actually mean? And so then we're like, well, you know what? We can just put them in 3rd grade math because clearly they know their multiplication facts, but they don't actually have that deep learning occurring and that foundational skills to build on.
Yeah, they're missing that connection of what that actually means. It's not so much the math facts per se, but how that is derived.
And because of that, our kids on the autism spectrum in particular, they're foolers. They're not trying to fool us, but they end up misleading us if we don't ask the right questions and if we're not the just right kind of detective to see what really is in their brain in terms of knowledge and deep understanding of a concept. We can be fooled, and it's not a good outcome. It's a disservice to a child to assume or wrongly infer that they have the capacity to be higher level math when they really don't understand that numbers represent things and quantity is just that. It can be abstract, and our kids struggle with abstraction. We know that.
Absolutely. Well, and then you throw in later on math where you're throwing in variables into the situation, and how do you rectify a variable that looks like a letter and correlate it to a number to someone who doesn't understand how to put those sets together?
Right. So as Ellen's talking about some of the struggles that our kids face in terms of the developmental sequence, and let's say the hand not being ready, so to speak, she's very much talking about, and we know as OTs, about a kind of readiness that's almost mechanical. Like, is the hand ready to perform this kind of grasp, to imitate this kind of stroke, and are the eyes working with the hands to do all that? And I want to point out the term readiness because in episode 2, we talk about readiness sort of like a moment-to-moment sort of thing. Readiness to mobilize to make contact with something, or readiness to take in information, that kind of moment-to-moment readiness, brain readiness. But this is skill readiness. And one of the things that we run into, whether it's a parent, a teacher, or really anybody who's trying to serve a child and help them, they want the child to do something that is standard and appropriate for their age, like cutting. And so they may want to work on cutting as a goal. And what they may not be thinking about is the child's readiness developmentally to do that well, not so much from the hand perspective, but from the cognitive perspective. So what that means is, in order to know what to do with scissors and to use the scissors properly, you need cognitive skills and motor skills, a little bit of visual motor skills too, as you know. But what happens for our kids, if a teacher or a grandparent or a daddy or a therapist or anybody puts scissors in the hands of a kid who, let's say, is in a 5-year-old body or even 6-year-old body, which clearly by 6 a child should be able to cut, right?
Right.
And they don't understand tool usage or what it's for, that child could accidentally cut anything, like a wire, like somebody's hair, like their skin. And so they're exploring, so to speak, because we're giving them access, but we might only be giving them access because we want them to develop or show a skill that they're not quite ready for.
And let's take a trip back for a second, too, because as you mentioned, that's a whole gross motor situation that they might not be prepared for because developmentally they're just not there. So, and I can just speak from experience with looking at my own child's development, that you feel a little less than parent-wise because you feel like you've done something wrong to not prepare them for that level of that gross motor, where it could just be something that's out of their control.
Fine motor specifically
Or fine
for
motor,
scissoring,
yes.
as opposed to gross motor, bigger movements, walking, running, that sort of thing. But, same kind of thing. Let's put it in gross motor terms because that's really a good segue, Dr. Smith. We are talking about kids who might be the last child picked for the soccer team, right? And it's because their gross motor skills aren't so developed. And so we have parents who understandably, and teachers and staff who understandably want these kids to be involved with some of those extracurricular activities or something social, especially over summer, right? But what we're doing is almost setting a child up to fail if the focus is go perform this gross motor skill just like everybody else, run the bases just like everybody else, hit the ball just like everybody else. And when I say everybody else, I mean there's variations of, mediocre, really great, not so great, whatever. But if they're already disadvantaged motorically, it almost sets them up to not be able to perform like their peers. So you have to ask yourself the question, if I want my child to be involved in a program like that, or a soccer team or a baseball team, what is my expectation of them? Is it social? Great. Do they actually need to play baseball to be social? Maybe, maybe not, depending on the league or the parent or the child or the team. Maybe they could be the water person or the treat distributor or the mascot. Like, if your goal is socialization, then that's a different reason to enlist in that kind of a activity or group.
And that takes us all the way back to episode 1, because if that's your goal, then you need to set the team to help provide the services necessary to get them there.
That's exactly right. So let me talk a little bit about an amazing program called Bee Buzz Baseball. My amazing friend, Wendell Field, is just this mastermind behind this program. And it's basically a youth baseball organization. And it's all volunteer. It's so wonderful. But about 4 years ago, Wendell came to me and said, we're trying to provide this baseball playing opportunity and bring the history of the game and the love of the game and the camaraderie in the community and all these wonderful developmental things that it can do to these kids that otherwise probably wouldn't have a lot of social outlets or easily available social outlets. And we have one who has special needs. How can we include him? And I was so grateful to Wendell and his infinite wisdom for eliciting our support, because through that we were able to help the mom and the child. We send our staff to those some of those games and such, and we worked with the child a little bit outside of that to understand things like how to run the bases and why that's part of the game and what it means to run the bases. So we almost took it apart, Rich, and baby stepped it, kind of like the skill acquisition, this developmental sequence, baby step it, understand how little pieces, parts of the game of baseball come together for the whole thing of baseball. But the point I want to make is what you talk about in our first episode of this transdisciplinary teaming, this collaborative process. Wendell knew to come to us as specialists and brought the mom to us so we could have a hand in shaping the child's success. Because otherwise, I think they would have inadvertently set him up to fail. And who wouldn't? If you don't know how that child processes best based on their condition or their autism or their special need, then you're almost providing an opportunity without the right kind of support to succeed at it.
Exactly right.
So thank you to Wendell Field and this amazing Bee Buzz Baseball. Shout out, great program, and it runs every year. It's great and available for many folks in and around the Cleveland area. and we will get some information for you on that program.
Yeah, we'll put it right in the show notes.
Perfect.
Absolutely. So we've talked about individuals and their struggles with the developmental sequence, but are there types, are there different variations of developmental sequence, and how does that play into coaching someone to work with it?
Absolutely. If you think of really any type of skill acquisition, there's a developmental sequence that goes along with it. And I want to tie back a little bit into what we talked about last time I was here when we talked about sensory processing, and that being the thing that underscores every aspect of life. It's the foundational skill for everything. And so when we see a child, as so many on the spectrum are, that have impaired sensory processing, we can expect that they're going to have impaired development across many domains. And so it may be, as we talked about then, some of their motor skill development or their social development. Really, their activities of daily living, their feeding, their toileting, all of that. Each of those areas has its own kind of developmental sequence, and when we have impaired sensory functioning, they're going to have hiccups along the way. Mm-hmm. And so our job as interventionists and as parents and everything is to look and say, what is normal skill development? What is the normal developmental sequence that if my child didn't have a diagnosis, they would be going through? And where are the holes? Our kids sometimes are very Swiss cheesy, where there are, they get some of these splinter skills or rote skills or whatever, but we have to go back and look and say, yes, we use the example of math. They know their math facts in terms of multiplication, but they don't have one-to-one correspondence, where they know that if I have, when I'm counting, one physical item in front of me, one is the number, the verbal one, 2 is 2, when we have actual physical objects in there. And so we can really look at any area of life and what you would expect a typical child to be developing in, and say, where should they be progressing and where is their foundational holes. And with kids, where we really need to focus is on play. Dr. Jean Ayers, who is the founder of sensory integration theory, talked about play being a child's work. Like, that is where a child should be learning their motor skills, their social skills, their cognition. And I do think we've lost that, not just in the field of autism, but really in just our society in general for children, of not truly understanding the importance of play for skill acquisition. But particularly with our kids on the spectrum, we really need to be looking at that, and that's where our treatment needs to lie, is in play, because it's where we can get all the other skills in.
Yes, there's a resurgence in education right now, because we've seen trends over the last couple of years where they're just killing the idea of recess, and just being able to cope with some of those social skills there, but then how that play relates to practice, and then later on as they get older, that relatability of what you're learning coming back to doing. Right. And so we're starting to see that coming back in education, because for so long they've questioned. So we're seeing that research coming back into the fold about how important play is.
Yeah, absolutely, Rich. There needs to be a focus on it, not only, with recess being taken away and what that does from a sensory perspective for our kids in terms of getting them to a place of readiness. They need that sensory experiences to then be able to be ready to sit and attend in a classroom. I would say, too, the, introduction of screens to our kids. How many kids are spending more time on an iPad or playing a video game than outside climbing on playground equipment or digging in the dirt or, playing kickball with the neighborhood friends, and the impact that that's having across the board. And, of course, this past year has done us no favors in that some of the developmental sequences of their kids are going to have some holes that, as a general society, autism or not aside, we are going to have to address, of the social development of our toddlers who have spent a year only seeing people behind masks, and the importance of the facial recognition and facial expressions in social development. There's definitely going to be work to do, and it starts by acknowledging that there are developmental sequences, that there is a role of neurodevelopment in the human formation.
That's right. And I think parents should not put the burden on themselves. Should be accountable to know all that. It's okay to recognize that a sequence exists, or that development is linear, skill acquisition is linear. But that's where the professionals like occupational therapists come in, and other professions that know the developmental evolution of how children develop. And parents need to rely on that knowledge and work within that understanding applicable to their child. They don't need to become developmental specialists for the world. They need to understand their child and the trajectory their child is on. And then follow the advice of the professionals to try to fill, as Ellen said, those holes in the foundation. She's absolutely right. In my course and over the years, just as speakers in different places Ellen and I have contributed and presented, we often talk about a kid being like Swiss cheese. You know, they're solid in some areas, but they're holy in others. And another analogy we use for parents out there and teachers that like this analogy and can relate to it, it's like having the foundation of a house, you know, making it very solid. And if there's a holy foundation or some boards that are weak or something not quite nailed or glued together properly, you're not going to have a very secure first, second, third, fourth floor. And so we want to make sure that we are developmentally approaching each child, seeing where the holes are in their foundation, finding the just right cement or glue or nails, as you will, to make that foundation solid, and then systematically build one layer after the other. And that's going to help the child become the best version of themselves. This house be the best, most solid version of a house it could be when we're sort of done with the developmental process.
And I think added on too, going back to what I've talked about in previous episodes about the scaffolding approach, having that scaffold there as part of that, to know that it's okay to double back if the first approach doesn't work as well as you want it to.
That's right.
You know, to take a step back and say, how can we reapproach this?
And sometimes, you know, the best of the best out there in terms of professionals, they only know what they know. You know, if you go to a special ed person, they're going to know how academics and cognition evolves. If you go to an occupational therapist, they may know how the nervous system and sensory systems and motor systems work together, and cognition, because we get a little bit of everything in OT. If you work with a PT, they're certainly going to know the motor system well. So all we know is what our disciplines teach us. It's this transdisciplinary cross-training, role releasing of many different professional perspectives that helps us be whole in our approach and comprehensive in our approach to caring for, assessing and caring for the children.
And the key to all of that is the parent.
Right.
They're the glue that holds it all together, because while they may not have been taught all these different developmental sequences, because, you know, maybe they're an accountant.
Right.
They know their child.
Right. Amen.
For sure. And so they are and they're the ones that oftentimes are the go-between between the different therapists, because unfortunately not everywhere has adopted a transdisciplinary approach. And so they might be going to one center for OT and the school has the intervention specialist and all of that. And so the parent is really the glue that holds it all together and keeps everyone focused on the child and where they are at.
And we need to do a whole episode just on parent advocacy.
Oh my gosh, for sure.
You know, just to let them know that, because I think they need that reassurance sometimes that, you know your own child, even if you don't know them that well, you know, developmentally, because you're still trying to learn how they operate.
Right.
But you are the baseline for your
and
child.
You set the standard for the culture in your family. You set the standard for the culture. And so that means, how does everybody wake and start their day? How does everybody approach mealtime? How do people deal with stress and trauma and joy and celebrations? And those things make a difference. I'll speak to this quickly, and then we'll move on to some other important developmental things that we want to talk about, like the different kinds of skill sets to develop in children. But if sitting at mealtime isn't important to a family, because they're a family on the go, and it's okay if they sit in front of the TV and catch the news while they're eating, or the child stands or grazes all day. That is a personal, to be respected cultural choice and influence. And so if we go in and try to structure up mealtime as the therapist or the psychologist or whoever, it may not fit the culture of the family, and therefore it's not going to be adopted and embraced. Developmental skill aside, you have to be able to match where the family and the child are at. So knowing what influences, it's not that the child can't sit or can't use a fork, it's that maybe culturally they're not expected to. And that's certainly the case for different places across the world where people live. I learned that working in a hospital setting where here I am as like a one-year grad, bushy-tailed, bright-eyed, what do we say, occupational therapist ready to take on the world. And I go into a feeding unit where I was working with a family who literally the grandma from a different culture picks up the food and puts it in the child's mouth. Well, the child was like 7 or 6. I'm like, oh no, we need to have a fine motor skill or a self-care skill for, using utensils. It's like, Not in this culture, we don't. Who are you serving? It's like, okay, I get it. It's not necessarily valued or necessary, and that's okay.
Right. So let's head back into developmental model then. Let's talk about the different areas. Where would you like to start, Ellen?
Let's start at play, just since, as I alluded to earlier, it's really where the child should be developing all these other skills. And so we need to look at the different types of play. And when we say play, there's actually several types of play. And when we, in the class that we teach online, you get into all those different things in a little bit more detail for sure and how to facilitate them. But suffice to say now, there's cognitive play, there's social play, there's motor play, and each of those have their own developmental sequences within it. So just to give like a quick example, if we're talking about social play, we start with the child is in solitary play, that they, don't play with anybody. As you think of an infant, they don't really play with toys with anybody else. And then they'll go to onlooker play where they are watching other children play while they're playing with their own stuff. And then we get into parallel play. I think most people have heard that term before, where children aren't actually really playing with each other, but playing next to each other. And then they go into associative play where they start sharing material. So if you have a child in a sandbox, if they're in parallel play, everybody has their own tools, their own pile of sand, and they're doing their own thing. In associative play, there might be a big pile of the different buckets and shovels, and they're sharing with them and saying, oh, can I borrow your shovel? Those sorts of things. But everyone's building their own castle. And then there's cooperative play where they're all building the sandcastle together in one castle. And so when we look at developmental sequence, we would never expect that a child who is in onlooker play should be expected to be in cooperative play and write a goal for them to be a cooperative play, or when their cousins come over to say, look, everyone's building, a house out of Legos, go join them. Because we need to honor the developmental sequence, and a child who is developmentally at an onlooker status needs to go through parallel play and associative play before they are ready for cooperative play.
And that is how developmental sequence is important to parents. They need to know that their expectations, again, we talk about managing expectations. You have to understand it's not that your child is aloof, one of the adjectives I despise the most in the English language, personal thing. It's not that they're disinterested. It's not that they're even choosing to be isolated. It's something else. They're not at the developmental level, and putting them in the context of cooperative play, building Legos as a group for the sake of making the just right palace or something, isn't going to give them that skill. So opportunity does not equal skill. Opportunity plus support and developmental scaffolding support, as you like to use the term, does equal results. And it's that middle piece of the supported scaffolding intervention where play therapy, developmental stimulation comes into place.
And so I think it's really important to remember, more important than age or grade level is the child's own developmental progress. And so we need to be thinking about developmental sequence, because if the child is progressing along the developmental sequence, whether they're, where a neurotypical fifth grader would be when they're in first grade, but they're continuing to progress, that's what we need to look at, is are they making it to the next step of that sequence?
Their own trajectory for development. And that's where, you can have different foundations that are holy, but the holes are in different places in different foundations. And all we care about is that particular house we're helping to build. So really individualizing, as true form the success approach is, really individualizing how we fill those holes with what, and with what we don't put in there. We also talk a lot in the success approach about what not to do, just as much as we talk about what to do.
If you ever have the opportunity to take the online training course, what I love about it the most is you get a chance to reflect for your own personal reasons on each one of these theories and models as it relates to you.
That's right. Reflect on the 7 different theories and models as it relates to you and your child, but know and embrace and reflect on, if you will, the hundreds and hundreds of methods that go with all of those theories that you can kind of cherry pick that do apply with the help of the instructor to your child, and that becomes your child's critical curriculum, your own recipe for their just right pie or their just right cake that you're baking.
Right. And I think sometimes as parents, and I speak personally as a mom of 5, you're just so in the trenches. You're just trying to survive the day.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that, it's hard to have this academic kind of exercise of, well, where are they at developmentally and what's their just right next step? And so I do think the online class offers that opportunity because there's a chance to journal and to pause and just say, not only to get the information you may never have had, or maybe you did, but you forgot because you're in survival mode.
Right.
But that opportunity then to take the time to reflect on it and say, what does apply to my child and what are concrete steps that I can make to take one thing at a time and just start implementing it.
Mm-hmm. Step by step for us too.
That's right.
What insight would you offer then, as we start talking about parent effectiveness? What strategies would you offer?
So I would think definitely just a generalized understanding of development. Some parents are, it's their first child and they have a diagnosis of autism. So they haven't had the experience of seeing up close and personal what typical development looks like to necessarily even know what should be coming next. And so the opportunity that you're in that situation to educate yourself as much as possible on what is the appropriate developmental sequence. But again, this isn't to add one more burden onto already overburdened parents, but take advantage of, there's so many resources out there besides first and foremost the team that is working with your child. Absolutely. And asking the questions of, okay, this is what they're doing now. What should I be looking for next? That's a great question to ask is, what is the next step? And how do we get there? And just look one step ahead. Sometimes that's all we can manage as parents of, what's the next step and do the next right thing and then the next right thing. And so trying not to get overwhelmed by they're 2 years old and they're never going to get to college because, they're not potty trained and they're not speaking, right now. And just say, what is the next step in the developmental progression for one area and then the other area and all of that. So really familiarizing what typical development is, either through your own experiences, talking to, your siblings who have kids, friends, whatever, but first and foremost, the professionals.
And I think there's a simple way to start to understand typical development by watching, and that is go to a playground.
Yeah.
Observe kids at parties, birthday parties. See how kids are out at recess. See how they are in a library in a small group of kids. Like, try to be observant mode. So parents are so used to performing and managing, and it's kind of like a, ringleader all the time running this rat race circus. But if you can pull back and just observe, even for literally 30 seconds, you will see this beautiful interplay. Regardless of who you're watching, there's a beautiful interplay, especially if you step back and don't govern. You see how kids are with each other. And in so doing, you kind of see, okay, my child's not even in the mix, and I can see that this kid is talking to that kid, and they're looking at each other. So a precursor to their conversation or maybe their friendship or their interaction is eye gaze. So in addition to looking at children, the second thing you want to do is, when I look at my child, what is missing in his experience as a player that is the common denominator? So you might notice that your kid, it does really great from a motor perspective, and they're climbing around and they're having a good experience and they're getting some fun outlets happening. And they do this really well alone, but the minute a peer comes in, it's like they can't even function anymore. They can't climb anymore. They're kind of stumbling. They've fallen apart. It's not that they don't have the motor skill. It's that they can't do motor and social together. And if you're watching this and you see every time when there's a social influence, my child falls apart, that's the kind of help you need. And the holes to fill are the social holes. And just knowing that where to attend and where not to attend, it can be energy saving and a little bit of a relief, because it's not, everything's not broken. He can certainly have his motor skills up to par, but not in the context of socialization.
Yeah, so it is really looking and seeing what do we want to focus on first, because every play interaction has all these different elements in it. You think like a game of soccer, there is the physical, kicking the ball. There's the cognition. You have to understand the rules of soccer. There is the sensory of, the feel of, the uniform and the cleats and the everything that some of our kids who have sensory issues might have, people brushing up against them, being in their proximity, the social, the communication. There's so many things that go into a simple, game of soccer among 6-year-olds. And so saying like, okay, I want my kid to play soccer. we can't attack it all at once. So what is the goal for this time? Well, maybe it might be practicing drills with daddy in the backyard just for the motor piece.
Exactly.
And maybe it's, kind of watching a video or having a simplified version of the rules another time. Or it's, just working with your OT to help them tolerate the high knee soccer socks that they have to wear.
Right.
Those sorts of things, and understanding there are many components, and that's okay. And we're going to knock them off the list one by one, so that eventually we get to this point where we're able to have this interplay between all of these different developmental needs.
And I think that helps parents to manage their own expectations because they have a goal within a goal.
Mm-hmm.
So if the goal is to be engaged in soccer or signed up with something kind of normalizing, so to speak, within that there's a mini goal of just tolerating the socks this week, and then the socks and the shoes, and saying hello to a friend the next week. Like, build and scaffold yourself under the direction of the strongest lead people on your team, hopefully occupational therapists that really understand your child and specialize in what we call task analysis. So by trade, we are specialists in breaking down, like Ellen said, all the motor things and bodily things, postural things that are necessary, emotional, social, pragmatic things necessary, visual, motor integration things necessary, et cetera, to say, hey, Mom, if I were you, I'd be working on blank. And then great, you set goals for blank, whatever that is.
And I think the key then, too, is to celebrate success.
Oh, my gosh, yes.
Like, we don't need to be comparing to, well, so-and-so at 7 years old is on Travel League.
Right.
Celebrate that your child wore the socks for 5 minutes.
That's
right.
right.
Like if that's their goal, then celebrate each little step along the developmental sequence that they check off. And that's a huge victory.
And, it goes back to what Dr. Smith said about collaborating. Let your coaches know what you expect too, because then they can reinforce the acceptance, the celebration, and might even help other families to know, okay, this child's purpose here isn't to be the star player. Mm-hmm. They really just need to have an opportunity to practice X, Y, Z. And you partner with me in helping that kid know from the stands they did a great job, whatever, wearing their socks or whatever. And not that they have to know details, but it can be a very collaborative and supportive environment for the parent if the parent is highly communicative and clear about what the expectations are.
We've talked a lot about developmental sequencing, and I know there's a lot more to do that we can probably highlight and talk for hours. So thank you, Ellen, for being with us again today. It's been a pleasure having you on the panel again, and you can come back again and again and again.
I would be happy to.
She's not the instructor of our class by accident, okay?
Well, thanks for having me again.
So today, listeners, the challenge is to choose one area of development that you are maybe most concerned about or prioritize. Discern where your child is at with the help of your team, and celebrate where they're at, maybe even videotape where they're at so that you can always remember this developmental level. And then do the work of discerning what is the next step in that skill set.
This was a powerful episode for me, and I was so blessed to share the microphone with Ellen and Lynette again to keep the conversation going. As a parent, the first thing I hope you take away is the beautiful notion of first knowing where your child is, period. Don't get wrapped up in what you see happening and just wish for your child. Be intentional and honest in your goal setting to meet your child where they are and develop your goals with your transdisciplinary team to reach them. Stay the course and stay focused on your goal and not societal expectations. Lynette, what are some other takeaways for this episode?
Well, I think we need to always remember and honor the fact that development is driven by the brain. Development is sequential, too, so we can expect it to evolve step by step. I think we also need to remember that play is the child's work, and occupational therapists and other professionals who are trained in neurodevelopment can help the child to fill the holes in their development, if there are any, so fill those foundational holes, and then use that new foundation to build more skills so they can succeed as a player and a learner. We also want to manage expectations by deciding what's most important to your family when it comes to your child's play development and focus on that single aspect rather than trying to use a play opportunity to address all of your concerns at once. We hope that you learned something today to help you on your journey with autism. We'll share more on our next Connect with Success podcast. Until then, expect success.
The Success Approach is a registered service mark protected under intellectual property law. Unless otherwise specified, all music, audiovisual, and proprietary content shared in this podcast is property of Autism Productions, LLC, and its sister agency, Integrations Treatment Center. The use of this content is unlawful without the expressed written consent of aforementioned agency. For more information about the Success Approach, please go to our website at www.thesuccessapproach.org.